It was an acceptance that I'd never received for having Tourette. It was also a verification of my own humanity, that I existed, that I wasn't invisible. I didn't need to become invisible or unimportant.
Hey, it's Ben, and this is an unexpected episode of Tourette's podcast, a special episode honoring someone we just lost, a total legend that the Tourette syndrome community worldwide lost on December 15th. Steve Bachner of Woburn, Massachusetts, was my Tourette hero. From when I was a little kid, he was my first frame of reference for Tourette syndrome out there in the world. Someone else who had Tourette syndrome, and here he is on TV. Me watching when I'm a little kid. It was an episode of the network television news magazine in 2020. It aired after my diagnosis. This would have been, I guess, the late 1980s, when I was just living with these tics under something called Tourette syndrome, but not really having any community. I was just a kid, and then I had a bunch of friends who didn't have Tourette syndrome. But now I was finally going to see it on TV, on national TV, this whole segment, and it was about Steve Bachner. The whole thing was about Steve, who we just lost. Too young, by the way. He was in his 60s. I've got an interview with him here. And so why haven't you heard this interview already? Well, this initially wasn't the interview that was going to air, which I thought was a bit of a bummer because it's great. It's really great. It's interesting conversation. The factors at the time we recorded this in May of 2020 were a really noisy phone connection that actually took a lot of work on the audio editing front. So there's a bit of background noise here from the phone line. And Steve in general was hoping that we could redo it if possible, which we tried to do a number of times, but either the timing was bad or Steve needed to rest, so we were never able to redo the episode, which would have had the similar content. But I thought this one, which he was still okay with airing, that you're about to hear, just had a lot of important things. As misunderstood and taken out of context as Tourette syndrome is this day and age, imagine how it was several decades ago, before really anybody walking down the street had any idea what Tourette syndrome was. Like, for example, you could tic and then say, oh yeah, that was just a tic, or that was just coprolalia. I mean, odds are people wouldn't know what the heck you were talking about back in the day. But Steve, sometimes through really difficult encounters, raised national and likely worldwide attention for Tourette syndrome back in the 80s, which he had mixed feelings about, and you'll hear them here. How would it feel to have Tourette be the label of identity that everybody places on you, instead of looking at the person that you'd like to be, or the person you are, or what your thoughts are? And this podcast obviously is about Tourette syndrome, and of course we talk about Steve's life with that, but in a way that I think leads him through a lot of emotion, where he saw himself, memories both good and bad, and absurd. Just wait till you hear this story of him filming an interview segment with John Stossel. It's ridiculous and funny. We talk about Geraldo and Jerry Springer, but Steve, as you'll hear, was a really passionate guy, and I'm glad I was able to reconnect with him a few years ago after starting the podcast, because it's Steve. He's a hero. I mean, you heard me talk about him in episode 0 of season 1. I mean, just talking about remembering him and Shane Festel and people like that, made me cry. And if you're unfamiliar with him, I just felt an obligation to do an episode with him. There was a lot more that we were going to, I think, go into his personal life upon re-recording, but I'm sad that didn't happen. The stories you do hear, though, from his life are so, I'll say, important for the Tourette and OCD communities. Important that we recognize them. So what unfolds here is a story of understanding your validity and humanity in a way that you don't have to hide. So here's me and the late Steve Bachner.
Hello?
Hey, Steve, it's Ben Brown.
Hey, Ben, sorry. I'm having telemarketer calls. Good to hear your voice.
Well, yours too. I know we've been trying to do this for a little bit. How are you doing?
I would much rather be able to have Tourette on my mind than what I've been dealing with the last several years. But yeah, we don't control those things.
Well, I mean, yeah, Tourette syndrome is what I want to talk to you about. I mean, your story is a huge missing link or missing piece on this podcast. I mean, we've referred to you as the old guard of Tourette syndrome, and people like you and Shane Festel, and I mean, you may be the very first person I knew of outside of myself who had Tourette syndrome. Could you talk about, I guess your intro to it? And I mean, this is back in a time when Tourette syndrome was not, the talk of the household. Can you take us through some of the early days of, this is setting on for you? What is it like? What is Tourette syndrome? I mean, what was your first encounter with this disorder that we live with?
I mean, I can say this in just in a synopsis that my first, I guess I would say, my first recollection of, well, let me say this first. I grew up in a very dysfunctional home. So it's very difficult when you're surrounded by emotional and physical abuse and just a lot of dysfunction. When you start to feel different, it's sometimes hard to put one's finger on why you're feeling different. It wasn't until I was probably 6 or 7 when my vocal and my head shaking, head shaking tics began that I started to really say, what's going on. And then skipping ahead maybe about 7, 8 years, just before I turned 14, I was having visitation or time with my father. He did not live in the home. And we were sitting in the car just on a side street. I had, for about a week, I'd been having this tic where I was going, shh, shh. I was shushing everything. And sitting in the window, all of a sudden, shh, turned into S-H-I-T. And I was absolutely mortified. He looked at me and said, "What did you say?" And I said, "I'll be right back." And I got out of the car and I just paced up and down the sidewalk for about 10 or 15 minutes. I had no idea why. I felt like I really, I felt like I was being taken over by an alien force. And that later evolved. I mean, the days went by into other coprolali and verbal sounds and animal sounds and etc. But in the past, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, maybe a little longer, I can think back to a very young age when I can actually think back to the origin of my first obsession, compulsion, urge, and that was lying in a bed or children's bed in my mother's room when I was, not sure how old I was at. I'm going to guess I was about 4, 5, 6. And the wallpaper was like a floral design, had little, and I would look at the design and I had this urge to think of the little separations between the little rose floral design as streets, and I would like map my way along the same way I would when I was in a car looking out a window, and I would say, "Oh, that looks like the church should be there, and there's a street." And I had this urge to use the wallpaper design as something to not distract, to take my mind off things or to concentrate and keep my mind active. And it was sort of, it was sort of a compulsion or an obsession and compulsion. And I mean, no one, I nor anyone else ever said stop doing it, so I don't know how hard it would have been, but I know that I did that often. And as I said, then the vocal tic started when I was about 6 or 7, and then the coprolalia and echolalia and all that when I was 13 or so, for my 14th birthday. So it evolved. But I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the online Tourette community about. I monitor. I don't post very much because I have a number of reasons, but a lot of discussion about people asking if their symptoms have gotten worse as they age or better. mine have actually decreased, but not sure that it's just age. I think the fact of the other illnesses that I've dealt with, the medical conditions, have had an impact in the same way that, or in a similar way that anytime I've been very febrile and had a high fever, my tics virtually disappear.
Really? You get a fever and then your tics just kind of go away or go down?
Usually about an 80-90% decrease when I have a temperature over 101, 102. So,
that's interesting.
I think it's physiological. I know I've talked to some people who have seizure disorders, and they've also reported, just as people with Tourette have reported, that when they have a fever, either their seizures get worse or the seizures abate. So I really think it's physiological. I don't think it's something that the cause can be seen, unless you're analyzing the brain electrically or chemically. But yeah, it's something I've tended to go through since I was about, I don't know, 13, 14. I've had, with the exception of a few years in the last 10 years, but I've had virtually annual viral or bacterial episodes. Usually happen right around my birthday, right around November. And raging high fever that goes up to when I was 14, 15, went up to 105.7.
Oh my God.
And since then, it's been anywhere in the 102 to 104, 104 plus range. And I'll be, have that kind of raging fever for anywhere from 3 to 5 days. Then the fever will disappear, and I'll feel totally wiped out for weeks, just like you do with mono. And during that whole episode, I'll go 2 and 3 weeks with like 70, 80%, 90% reduction in the symptoms. Then as I start to physically feel better, the tics increase and come back. And it's like, oh, hello, little friend. I thought you forgot about me.
I'm back.
Yes. I mean, I would go into the hospital emergency ward or urgent care or see my primary in Boston. And, they would always be totally buffooned by it. They had no idea what was causing these roaring high fevers. They thought on one occasion, they had found some blood and were in the next room where the electron microscope was located. And all of a sudden I heard one of the physicians and one of the lab people say, "Whoa, what is that?" And one of the other people said, "I don't know, but it's not there any longer." And they came into the room and said, "Well, we saw something in your blood, but it was only there for about 5 seconds."
What?
We have no idea what it was. I said, "Well, maybe I am alien."
Alien Steve.
No, the essence of it is that I've always found that certain things, and not all folks with Tourette that I've talked to identify with this. A lot do, but some don't. That fever, malaise, all that tend to decrease tics, and other things tend to increase, such as lack of sleep or complex anxiety. I trained and worked briefly as an EMT medic, and I had no problem dealing with acute stress, in a car accident with horrific injuries. I had no problems at all, but long-term anxiety or long-term meaning days and weeks, or even days, the tics will increase. So, it's not always a consensus with folks I've talked to, but yeah.
So when did Tourette syndrome specifically set on for you? Was it, when you were like 5 or 6, or was it more in your teenage years, or what? Just talk about that for a bit.
Oh, it's definitely in my teens. I'd say between the ages of maybe 14, 15, and 18 was probably the most severe period. When I 19, the person I was seeing, well, it happened rapidly, as in one day, but moved in with me.
Oh,
And
wow. Nice.
yeah, and I found certain other activities decreased tics.
Okay. I think I
So,
follow.
yeah. So, yeah. But I found that, the tics were still pretty, somewhat severe, but, I'd say on a 1 to 10 scale between the age of about 14 and 17, 18, I'd say they were like an 8, 8.5, 9 sometimes. And that from the age of around 18, 19 to about 25, 26, actually a year my father passed away, 1986, they tended to decrease and were pretty subdued. I mean, still had the copulae, but I was calmer with it and able to cope better. And I think there was a lot of it too, that I was able to decrease the anxiety because I went from a feeling of responsibility to explain myself every time I went into a store, a restaurant, to more of a framework of I have a right to be here like everyone else does. I need to take some responsibility, but I'm not going to, one of the things I would do, and I think many would try to do, is try to hold the symptoms and just suck those tics in. And I decided I wasn't going to do that any longer, that it was just too draining, too tiring. And when I made that decision to just let it out, the level of tics decreased after a period of time. And I think that's because the stress of having to hold them in and feeling abated, and with that, the stress lowered and the symptoms solved. Then the year my father passed away, I don't know if there was any correlation, but which was 1986. He passed away in January. Actually, his burial was the same day as the Challenger explosion, and which was kind of odd. And about 6 months later, I think it was in June, I had my first experience with what folks refer to today as a tic tac. I found myself curled up in a semi-fetal position on the couch, just howling like a wild wolf. I was so much pain. I had never at that point even experienced pain that even close to that. And it was incredible. I finally got myself in. I think I drove, which was should never have done, but I got to see. I don't know if you know Dr. Barbara Coffey.
I know the name. Yeah, I remember the name from back when, I think.
Yeah, for 35 years, she was my Tourette physician of record up until about 3 years ago when she moved to practice to Miami. And that was I used to travel to see her in New York on Amtrak, but going to Miami on Amtrak was going to be a little too much. So, from there's about 30 some odd years. And I made it into her office in 86 that summer after being seen by about 4 or 5 other physicians who absolutely either had no knowledge of Tourette or had just very limited book knowledge and no experience, no empirical, it really were not suited to treat anyone with Tourette. I found Barbara Coffey, and when the symptoms, I first started seeing her, I made it emphatically clear that I did not, ever since my experience back in my teens with Haldol and all the Trilofan and all the neuroleptics and all the crap that I in my reaction.
Yeah. Were you on an Anafranil?
No, I was, Haldol, both orally and I believe without my knowledge, I did that, which I can explain with IV.
Okay, because I remember at a national conference one time when I was a kid, I swear this was you, during one of the presentations, and I think this might have been during the presentation Oliver Sacks gave, where I thought it was you. Someone yelled "over the hill with a Anafranil," and it was like the best tick I'd ever heard.
No, That was someone else. Never
Whoever it
did
was.
a national. Started the first medication I was about. Yeah, actually, just after I was diagnosed, just before I turned 14, was Haldol. And then with my hospitalization in a day hospital mental health system, I was put through the ringer with other neuroleptics. I don't know if I was on Prolixin. I know I was on Thorazine,
Wow.
Stelazine, Belarul, and a whole arsenal of other very potent dopaminergic drugs that had horrific side effects. The most prominent of which is a side effect called akathisia, which is an absolute, it's like a level 10 panic attack that is stretched out over days, weeks, and months. All I could do was pacing and moaning under my breath. And I actually, I wore out I told this to many people, and they were looking and say, how can you do that? I wore out a brand new pair of sneakers in about 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
From just the pacing up and down hallways and
oh my God.
sidewalks and whichever else have you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in really bad shape. And of course I was alone with this. I didn't have parents. I'm an only child. I had no one. It was just me. And trying to figure all this out.
Well, yeah. I mean, how did you figure this out? I mean, so again, like Tourette syndrome is not a household word at this time period. How did you come to, I mean, how did you explain it to people? What was your first answer as to what this was?
I didn't have a formal answer. I mean, initially, before my diagnosis, I would tell people it's a nervous habit. I think I always felt, I knew it was something that I couldn't help doing. I didn't feel that I was bad for it. I didn't feel that, I mean, I know I was being mistreated for it by family, school, etc. But I felt that there was an answer somewhere, but I didn't know what it was at the time. And when my diagnosis came along, it was really kind of almost funny because diagnosis came from a psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital Medical Center, and he had said to me, I think what you have is a condition called Gilles de la Tourette syndrome, which is very rare. And he went on and talked about it. And I remember him saying, the months and even possibly years in front of you are going to be very difficult, and we don't know enough about it, et cetera. So I left his office, and the only thing I was thinking is it must be terminal. So I spent that day and most of the next day thinking I was going to die from this thing. I hadn't started doing any research yet. So I think it was the next day or the third day after diagnosis, I went back into his office and pulled what I call a Mannix, the TV show Mannix.
Yeah, I remember Mannix.
Where, or I actually, no, more like a Rockford maneuver.
Rockford Files.
Where I walked into the doctor's outer office with a secretary, and she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I need to speak to the doctor." I just walked into his office, and he was seeing a patient.
Oh my God!
And I think I was oblivious to the fact there was someone in the room.
Uh-huh.
I walked up and I said, "How long do I have?"
Oh my God!
And he looked straight at me, and he kind of motioned me to an outer room.
Yeah.
And he said, "You seem upset." I said, "Wouldn't you be?" "What's wrong?" I said, "Well, I need to know how long I have." Wow. And he looked at me and said, "How long you have to do what?" I said, "To live." He said, "As long as you normally would live." I said, "But you just told me that the months and possibly years are going to be difficult." And he finally got clued in. He said, "Oh, well, Tourette is not terminal. It's just hard to deal with." I said, "Yeah, you're telling me this?"
That's why you're there.
I said, "Give me the white jacket and you walk around with Tex." I said, and then we'll see who knows this. But I literally spent 2 days, maybe even 3, actually thinking that Tourette was terminal. And then after that encounter, I spent about, 14, 15, 16, about 3 years. I would spend probably 3 to 5 days a week at the Boston Public Library, at the Medical Co-op Library, at the Harvard Medical School Library, getting every bit of information I could on Tourette. Even got a copy of the original papers by Georges Edward Brutus Gilles de la Tourette.
Huh? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Like the original? Wow.
And yeah, I just needed to get as much. I just needed to fill myself with as much information and know as much. And I said, if I'm going to live with this my whole life, I need to know everything I can. By the time
well, I mean, after having seen the doctor, what were you expected to do? I mean, what was there, was it, here's the medication, this is the best we can do? Or, I mean, what were the marching orders after you had spoken to your doctor?
The psychologist who diagnosed me referred me to a it was actually a neurosurgeon, I think, but the neurologist who started me on Haldol.
Yeah, that's where I started too.
And that's when my nightmares with medication reaction started. But they started off slow and then got hideously bad. But it was probably, I remember that, well, a couple of things coming to my mind now I haven't thought about in years. I remember the first time I was ever thrown out of any major place. It was Mass General Hospital, believe it or not.
What? The
of
hospital.
All places, one of the country's most well-respected medical institutions. I was in there visiting a couple that I knew through CB radio, which had become a way for me to communicate and keep busy, whatever, in the wee hours of the morning. Usually I'd get on there at 11 in the evening and be on until 3, 4 in the morning. And there was this couple that were blind and utilized guide dogs. And I went to visit them at, one of them was inpatient and the other was visiting. I went to visit at the hospital. While I was in the room visiting, somebody heard me and heard my text.
Oh boy.
And the security showed up at the room. And, and afterwards, some physician in the hallway came in and said, "You can't be doing all those behaviors around sick people."
Yeah.
These people have medical conditions. And I just stood there, other than my symptoms, I just stood there blank face going, who is this fool?
Yeah,
Where did you steal a white jacket and a stethoscope from? And finally, somebody summoned a senior physician who came along and clarified and said, "Oh, that's a condition named Tourette Syndrome. Wow. Don't worry about it. Learn the name. You'll never see another case. Don't worry about it."
Yeah.
And I've heard that said 2 or 3 times in my life by physicians who said, that when they were going to med school, they were told, learn the name, but don't worry about it. You'll never see a case of it.
You have to remember this. I had come across a news article, and this is something I think I remember about you from back in the day. Getting kicked out of a hamburger joint or something like that. Do you remember this? Like this was in the newspapers and everything.
Well, yeah, do I remember it? Yeah, boy. If I live to be 300, I won't forget that. Actually, was that what conference did I meet you at?
It was either DC or Houston, Texas. One of the national conferences.
Right. It was at a Tourette conference, and we're 20 years apart. And I was probably 20. You must have been 7, 8?
Yep, right around there. 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah. My first conference I went to was in Kansas City, Missouri in 1985. 85 was Kansas City, Missouri. And the one with the Wendy's incident was 3 years later in 1987 in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Cincinnati, that's where it was.
Yeah, I was... the first time I ever met anybody else with Tourette syndrome was in 1977. I was 17. And I went to my first Tourette conference in New York City. And I walked into this Guggenheim Auditorium, the feast probably, I'm going to guess, 300-400 people. There were probably 100 people there. And some were ticking, and I was the most prolific, but people with different ticking. And I'm thinking, I don't even know what I was thinking. I was just overwhelmed, going, I'm home. That was really feeling. It's like I'm home.
And so we're getting to this story about the Wendy's and getting kicked out of a Wendy's hamburger joint. But I know exactly what you mean. And that's how I felt, I guess after starting the podcast, of just more of a feeling of home, because there's more a sense of recognition. Like you just find yourself out there.
There was a duality of emotion. A big part of me was so relieved that even before I met anyone, and that I felt, wow, I'm not alone in this world. It's very difficult for me to talk about that. But, yeah, it's okay. It was an acceptance that I'd never received for having Tourette. It was also a verification of my own humanity, that I existed, that I wasn't invisible. I didn't need to become invisible or unimportant, or I just, if everyone else in this room, or a large majority, have the same thing, then I'm validated. I noticed, I was 17, I noticed a boy about, I'm going to guess he was between 10 and 12, that was sitting at the far end on the same, they were like pews almost, the benches. And he kept sliding closer and closer to me. Like every time I looked away, he would slide up closer. And I noticed he had tics and vocalizations. And, and then I looked over, I said, hi. I said, my name's Steve. I said, what's yours? He told me. And we I don't recall it. We just chatted a little bit. And then he looked straight. I mean, talk about laser connection. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, can I ask you something? You won't get mad? I said, well, you can ask me anything you want to.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, when I get older like you, am I going to be doing what you're doing? Am I going to be like you?
Wow.
And that really, talk about like trauma. I mean, that was like,
wow. I
didn't know how to swallow that. That was like choking on a giant gumball.
Wow. Yeah.
I didn't know initially how to respond. And then after about 2 or 3 minutes, kind of choking back tears and trying to, I talked with him. I said, well, depends upon what you mean as far as are you talking about the curse words and how bad my tics are? He goes, yeah, mostly. I go, there's no one that can tell. Everybody, some people get worse tics like mine. A lot of people don't get worse tics. Some get better as they get like into their teens and over teens. So I said, I wish I could tell you. Not even the doctors can tell you that. We talked a little bit, and I remember before he left, he said, can I ask you one more question? I said, sure. He goes, can I give you a hug? And that was and he did, and that was the last time I ever saw him. I often wondered what happened, what became of him. But
yeah, of course,
that was an incredible, I grew 15, 20 years in that one day.
Wow. Yeah.
Emotionally, yeah, super heavy. Yeah. I mean, I came back from that conference feeling so light in so many ways, but so heavy.
Yeah.
And for about how many years? I was 17, 18, 19, probably for about 4 or 5 years. I would go down annually to the conference. I'd drive down sometime with a friend. That particular conference was what prompted probably an incident that created more public awareness, especially anywhere within 100, 200 miles of Cincinnati.
Yeah,
was the afternoon, the second day, This was in November of '87. I went during a break time. I went I went out of the hotel and across the parking lot to a Wendy's to just get something to nibble on or whatever. And I got a lemonade and some chili. And I was standing in line waiting to get my order when the manager came up to me and said, "Oh, you can't do what you're doing. You have to leave." And I happened to have all the literature with me from the conference, including pamphlets. And I kept handing them to him, and he kept handing them back. He goes, I don't care what it is. He says, I don't care if the Pope is here with you. You can't do what you're doing in here. And I said, "Sir," I said, "it's a violation of my civil rights. You tell me to leave because of that." And he goes, "How about if I call the police and tell them you robbed me?" So at that point, I said, okay, I don't want to be here if he's going to pull that. So I left and went across back to the conference, and there were some people in the bar, the lounge, having drinks. And someone had already heard what had happened and run in and told everyone else, "Hey, did you hear? Steve got kicked out of a Wendy's." There was a fellow there whose name I always forget. He was a former police officer in Philadelphia, I believe, who had Tourette. And he came up to me and said, "I know what happened." He said, "Head back to your room for about half an hour. Let me deal with the cops when I get here. Let me deal with it." I said, "Okay." So apparently I spoke to him afterwards, and he said, "Well, what the cops told me was that they didn't have, I explained Tourette, and they already knew about it. One of the cops knew about Tourette. And the cop had said to him, 'We don't have an issue with Mr. Bachner.'"
Right.
And what he said, why am I blanking? He said, "Well, you may not have an issue with Mr. Bachner, but Mr. Bachner has an issue with Wendy's." And the cop said, "Well, we can't deal with that," and they just left. As the hours went on, there was a senator from Ohio who got involved, who heard what had happened, and I think I'd made a comment. A few other people in the group, friends with Tourette, who said, "How do we get some publicity for this?" I remember the senator putting his hand out and saying, I need coins for the payphone." Everybody was, I think he must have gotten like $5 and change. Everybody was giving him coins. He went over to the payphone and made a call to him. We didn't overhear it. But all I can tell you is that for the next day and a half conference, there were live media, TV stations coming in, interviewing myself, myself and the girl I was dating at the time was at the conference with me.
Right.
I think I was interviewed by 2 TV stations, a radio station, and 2 or 3 newspapers.
Amazing.
I told my story so many times. And then one of the TV stations broke the news that evening. The reporter is standing with the backdrop of Wendy's behind her. She's going, "If you were in Cincinnati earlier today, you know where the beef was." Yeah. Where that was the lead story. Where's the beef? She went into explaining, young man from Brookline, Massachusetts, et cetera. Went into the whole story. And I have to say that if you look online, there was an article about the whole conference written by my dear late friend Adam Seligman, who wrote the article about the conference. Oh, that was the conference of all conferences.
For sure, yeah.
87.
Legendary.
And which was the conference you were at that we met?
So what I remember is it was shortly after, maybe a couple years after the 2020 special aired. And this is the first time I had heard about Tourette syndrome, like on TV. Like, this is what Tourette syndrome is. This is what it looks like in another person. Like, you became my frame of reference. Do you remember how that came together? How, was it John Stossel, I think, approached you? Or?
Oh, my God. I honestly can't remember how Stossel got in contact with me or why. The man is a nightmare. But, I mean, I had a choice of having Tourette syndrome or being John Stossel, I'd stick with having Tourette syndrome. And I am not kidding. But yeah, he came to the first part of the interview. If you remember the interview, there was a segment of the show where he was interviewing me in a coffee shop.
Yep, absolutely.
Totally a coffee shop that was called Coffee Connection. We were in there, and John Stossel decides that he's going to invite his 80-something-year-old father, who has never seen him work. He's going to choose that interview to invite his father to. First, he mentioned he's going to have his father there. So I said, okay, whatever. I don't care. The only problem was his father had to get up to use the bathroom about every 5 or 6 minutes.
Yeah.
And so they had to cut the interview and start again. About every 5-7 minutes. And 2 of the times he got up, he tripped over a cable, knocked over a camera,
oh my God,
knocked over a lamp, one of the lighting elements they had set up in the coffee shop.
Disaster.
It was crazy. But then they did, I think that was 3 segments. They did the coffee shop segment.
Yeah.
3 or 4. Coffee shop segment.
It's like a shopping mall.
Segment in the mall.
Yeah.
That was the old Arsenal Marketplace Mall in Watertown, Massachusetts, which is no longer.
Right, yeah. Right. And I remember the producer was asking people at the mall, like, what do you think's wrong with him? Is he on drugs, or what do you think's happening with this guy?
Yeah, what they didn't show much of, or I don't know if they showed it all, was they were walking around with all their gear and shopping carts, all the cameras and everything.
Yeah.
People would keep running up to my defense and say, "Hey, would you stop photographing him?
Oh, wow.
He can't help it." And people, even that didn't know Brett, will go, he's obviously not doing it on purpose. Why don't you leave him alone?
Wow. Yeah.
And I would have to come to the defense of the 2020 crew and go, no, it's okay. They're here to interview me. And people would look at me and go, "Oh, so you know them?" I said, "Yeah."
Huh. That's pretty cool, though.
It was just, back then especially, it felt so good to be acknowledged, and even more so when people would actually come to my defense or, something to that effect. Can't remember the last time that's happened because, I haven't really had any major, I haven't been out in public in about 3 years, but I haven't had any major, incidents happen with the public or anything, probably 10, 15 years, at least. But the 2020 segment, there was a mall piece, there was a coffee shop interview, and then there was, the part with me driving, getting in my car, driving.
Yeah, I remember that part. So that's when you had a punching tic, and you were sort of punching at John Stossel's face. And you kept saying fossil Stossel, I think, as well. Yeah.
And also I kept coming out with glossy fossy, glossy Stossel, glossy fossy. My tick with his name. my arm punching tick. Which I put my arm through a window one time with that.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And he would jump. Oh, it was really picture about 7 people that were his photographer, lighting director, cosmo, whatever you call it, makeup person.
Right, sure.
Him, his father, me, I think it was one or 2 other people. It was like 8 of us squished in the front of this coffee shop. George Howell, the owner, gave us an hour and a half to use the shop door, which is really nice. And then every time it was like a cacophony. It was like a symphony of strangeness, because I would have an outburst. Stossel would jump about 5 feet away, and bumping into things. And a second later, his father would go, "I got to go to the little boy's room," and he'd get up, knock something over inevitably, and we'd have to start all over again after he came back from the bathroom.
That's like an absurdist scenario.
Oh, it was like the absurdity of the segment, I think, lasted about 7 or 8 minutes, but it took us over 2 hours to put together because of how many times we had to stop.
Wow.
I think it took closer to 3 hours actually. And there was another part to it. I have that segment on, believe it or not, on VHS.
I think I do too. Yeah, I remember watching it repeat times because that was like wow, okay, this is the guy with Tourette syndrome. Like you became the guy. But this was me as a kid, viewing it and just you became my frame of reference. But I mean, that makes me wonder: do you feel like it was a fair portrayal of you? I mean, obviously there was a lot of like disaster going on, but do you feel like it represented you in a fair way?
Yes and no. I think they cherry picked what would make for good TV.
Yeah, I can see that.
I don't think they got the real essence of me as a person,
right,
battling to be accepted as a human being in society, completely. I think that, again, they got part of it in the mall, but of course, never filmed any of the people coming up and coming to my defense.
Right. Yeah.
Which
that would have been great. Yeah.
I think I've always, whenever I've done probably interviews of different sorts, newspaper. And my first interview was a newspaper interview in the Boston Herald. When I moved into my first apartment, I was 16 and a half. I think I just turned 17 when I did my first interview, and that was for a newspaper article. And since then, I've done, I can't begin to think how many newspapers and TV shows and whichever.
Right,
I did probably from the age of 17 to 30, when I did most of I was sort of the TS poster boy in many ways.
Yeah, that's fair to say. I saw a lot of it.
I felt a real calling to get the word out there and to be transparent. But I think media always has a need to sensationalize.
Yeah.
And the ratings game. And I think when you have someone like Stossel, he's always going for the kill as far as the money shot, looking for how he can best get that
sensational moment.
And I mean, a lot of people came to me and said, "Wow, you really got slaughtered in that." And I had mixed reactions. I looked at it and I said, "Well, no, they didn't get everything right. A lot of stuff was really hyped up, and I think more could have been done in the interview,
or less,
and less would just follow me around in a mall."
Yeah.
But to see the person, I mean, the mall, you're really seeing people's reactions. You're not seeing Steve, you're seeing people's reactions to Steve.
Right, yeah.
How about Steve's reactions to people?
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
And that's something that doesn't occur with the media. But at the same time, I've always balanced that with the need to get public awareness out there. And maybe I've been too forgiving, but my story has never been completely told. And I think that's because, again, the media likes to sensationalize. And when you have a condition, where you have coprolalia and where you're going pig suck in front of police officers and the N word in front of black people and the CH word in front of Asian people, that's open fodder. That's the greatest material for sensationalizing.
Right.
It's real, but it's sensational.
So the other big one I remember was Geraldo. Do you remember that experience on the Geraldo show?
Geraldo. Actually, I did the Geraldo one. I think I was the last show or one of the last shows before. Oh, wait a minute, I'm confusing them. Geraldo. I'm thinking about Jerry Springer. I did Jerry Springer.
Oh, you did Springer too.
I did Geraldo. Geraldo. Do you remember the episode where Geraldo had the skinheads on?
Where he gets his nose broken.
And he got his nose.
Yeah.
Well, I was on a few episodes after that. And
So Geraldo was still in bad shape.
Yeah, his nose was broken during that. And I was on, I don't know how many episodes after that.
Right.
And the punching ticket. At one
the
point,
punching tick.
It actually, they taped it. He said something like, I don't want another broken nose because of my punching, my arm punching tick. But,
nice.
Geraldo's a character. Then I did Jerry Springer just before, I think, one of the last normal shows he had. Well, how can you call it?
Yeah.
Well,
before it turned into
yeah. But I mean, before it went into the craziness of the Jerry Springer and women flashing to get his beads and everything. Before all that, I was for a couple of years. So he had a relatively benign interview format, and I was on that with 2 or 3 other people with Tourette syndrome. My friend Joanne Cohen, myself. There was another. I think there was another male on there. I don't remember who it was. And
well, I remember the panel was pretty much the all-stars, I guess you would say, like the group you hung out with back in the day. I mean, you knew all of them from the Tourette conferences and so on. And they were certainly no strangers to media at the time. I mean, a lot of them were making news in the same way you were. I think you were probably you had to be the highest profile one because you were the one from my home in North Carolina, you were the one I always saw. Did that kind of thing bother you? The sort of media attention and, you had to kind of be the quote unquote guy with Tourette syndrome, the go-to. Did that bother you?
I think there's always been a sense of being, lack of a better word, I think it really hits the nail on the head, being used to achieve someone else's goals.
Yeah.
And I've always sort of written it off in the sense that, well, if it gets more public awareness out there, then, I'm willing to be the scapegoat. Did it feel good? No. There were plenty of times I cried over it, or I felt very depressed and sad. But I would buoy myself up by saying, look, it's getting the word out there, more people getting diagnosed. One of the greatest feelings is when I would go into a public place and suddenly, a parent and a child or couple would walk up to me and go, I saw you on Geraldo. My kid was diagnosed because of you. It's like there's no feeling in the world like that. Just knowing that, that I did something at maybe a little bit of a cost to me, emotionally, but it helped get someone diagnosed, or maybe it helped get someone better accepted. Of course, being OG, I don't know if OG is old guard or original gangster, but
I'm going to say old guard on this one. We've called you the Tourette old guard. Okay, so this next segment skips ahead quite a bit. The phone line was just getting a little bit too noisy, and it remains pretty noisy here, but you can still make it out. It's nothing like that. Just want to point out we're skipping ahead a little bit, back to the useful audio, and the timing is really good on that because he starts talking about why he began to attend Tourette conferences. He goes into the big questions he was asking himself, and he also talks about his friendship with Robin Williams. Getting back to it, me with Steve Bachner.
My reason for going was because, okay, here I have a name. I finally have a diagnosis. What do I do? It's not terminal, but how do I live with it? I'm not going to die with it, unless I say I have the wrong tick in front of the wrong person. But but how do I live with this? There's no one locally who understands me. So I started going to the group to get support. But by the third meeting, after sharing stuff, and people had, heard my talking about how I had spread the word to different stores I went into and how I handled myself. most of the people who attended the meetings were parents, and they would come up and speak to me and ask my suggestions on how to deal with schools and who to speak to. And lo and behold, I ended up becoming. I went looking for support, but I ended up being the person providing support. And that is a phenomenon that's repeated itself so many times in my life that I can't say it hasn't left some bitterness. It hurts. It really hurts because it's you kind of you bury your soul and you say, okay, I'm broken. I'm working to try to fix myself. I'm working to try to find where I belong and to get some people to buoy me a little bit and be there for me. And yet I'm being overwhelmed by other people coming to me and saying, God, you know so much, you know how to do it at such a young age, and how to get people where or whichever else have you. And I can't say no to them because it's not in me. So, that was kind of what led to the genesis of Mr. Tourette.
Mr. Tourette. I mean, what was that?
Which was actually the name I was given in one interview I did. Was that was the name of the headline in the interview was Meet Mr. Tourette.
Establishing you as kind of like the go-to guy. I mean, you became the go-to guy for Tourette stories.
Yep, I'm the go-to guy, which, there's a part of me that likes that. I mean, I like to be helpful. I like to be, who doesn't like to be important? Who doesn't like to know that they're doing something that's important and that's helpful, etc. But when it's at the cost of not getting the same for yourself, it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, I understand.
And that's something I've never. I'm sharing with you. I've never shared that in any interview or in any forum. Maybe once or twice with very close people I consider close, but I've never really talked about that.
Well, I mean, we're talking about, your life with Tourette syndrome, and the focus of Tourette's podcast is people's lives with Tourette syndrome. But I'm hoping that you feel like you're being heard, and that the people listening are hearing you as, not Mr. Tourette, but the human being not to be trivialized. I mean, you have been such a massive influence on me when I was a kid. I mean, like being the adult I saw who you seemed cool. You seemed to have it together, and I really, really admired that. And when you stop and talk to me, along with Shane and some of the others from the group, it was yeah. I mean, I remember what the room looked like and everything like that. I mean, it was so impactful on me, just that you took the time to talk to me like a human being, and I think it's because you knew what it was like to maybe be kind of trivialized. I had been in the newspaper and all that stuff, and didn't necessarily like the experience. I mean, I grew up masking my tics and all that because I didn't want to be the guy with Tourette syndrome. I wanted to be, me. And I do realize there's a privilege in being able to do that. It's not possible for everybody with Tourette. But I mean, thinking back to all of this, I mean, it helped me so much too. I talked about you on the first episode of Tourette's podcast. I mean, I kind of like choked up thinking about it, thinking about you, thinking about Shane and what that meant to me. I mean, you just had that level of empathy that we talk about on Tourette's podcast so much. But, hearing you talk about it, I recognize the challenges that you went through. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to experience them to that level and at that time period. But
well, thank you. That means a lot to hear and to feel. I don't, as much as there is, I use the word bitterness or some pain about not getting the support that I needed at that time or at any time in my life, my adult life to date. At the same time, as I said, a while ago, every time that someone has said that I've touched your life in some way positively, that leaves an impact. That leaves a very positive impact, and it's important. I was fortunate when I was about 17. I was walking through my local hospital, Beth Israel in Boston, which is right on the border. It's technically Boston, but it's on the border of Boston, the town I grew up in, Brookline, Mass. And I was walking through the hallway, and I passed by a doctor who was probably at the time, I don't know, 40. And he heard my tics, and as I'm walking away from him, he's walking away, I hear him go, "Stop, Tourette." I didn't stop. Gilles de la Tourette. And I turned around, and my God, I mean, no one's ever caught on to it that quickly. This is like the doctor at Mass General who saved me from getting kicked out, and him and one other person. And I turned around and I said, "Yeah," and he came up and introduced himself. He said, "My name is Norman Geschwind." He said, "I'm the chairman of behavioral neurology at the hospital." He goes, "I would love to have you come and speak with me and sit and just chat." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Do you want to set up a time?" I said, "Whatever." He goes, "Well, I was just going to go have lunch now. Let's grab a sandwich and go back to my office."
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm guessing probably spent 2.5, 3 hours talking. Most understanding, sensitive guy. We met, I think, 1 or 2 other times, and then he invited me to speak at the graduating class of Harvard Medical School, which is I was the first non-physician, non-quote-unquote professional to get that honor and to be, I don't even know if I was 18 when I spoke. I was either 17, just turned 18. Mm-hmm. To speak to a graduating class at Harvard. I didn't get cold feet until about 15 minutes after it was all over, and I walked outside on Longwood Avenue. All of a sudden I said, "Oh my God, I just spoke to Harvard Med School."
Like, what did I just do?
What did I just do? Exactly. And so, I mean, I guess my sense is, while Tourette has certainly brought a lot of tragedy and travesty and sadness into my life, there have been some high points.
For sure.
At my old age, and I'm getting to a point where you have to really balance, try to find that balance between what tastes good and what you can swallow and what you can't.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you too about, you mentioned some doctors along the way, and I know that you were not a stranger to Dr. Oliver Sacks, who we talked about on the podcast a while back. There's a documentary on his life out now. What are your recollections on Dr. Sacks and your time with him?
Well, let's see. I met Oliver the first time, I think, was at that 87 conference in Cincinnati.
I was definitely at a conference with Dr. Sacks.
It might have been 85, but I know that he was at 87.
That sounds right.
And the group of us would notice this odd, chubby man with a big beard that would be walking around and taking furious notes on this notepad and constantly changing pens, which I later learned is because he had 4 different colored pens: black, blue, red, and green, and each pen signified something different to him. So he was always changing the pens. That and carrying around like myself, he was very heat sensitive. So he would carry around a little mercury thermometer and always take temperature readings in any room he was in. So we noticed him. And we also noticed he seemed to have almost some tic or OCD kind of things going on. So we often wondered if he had Tourette. So I started meeting him at the conferences. And then in 1989, he called me, early 89 or late 88. He called me to let me know that his book, Awakenings, had been turned into a screenplay for a film, a movie that was going to star Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, and going to be directed by Penny Marshall. I said, "Oh, that's fantastic." But I'm kind of thinking to myself, why is he telling me this? He's calling me. He doesn't usually call me. I see him at conferences every 2 years.
Right, yeah.
Why is he? He goes, "Well, I'd like to invite you down for 2-3 days to meet with the cast and the crew
That's so cool.
And if you'd be so kind to interview you, because even though Awakenings is not about Tourette, a
Right.
lot of the manifestations can be similar. And we want the actors to get a flavor of what it's like to live with a neurological condition, a movement disorder, and to get that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So before you even asked me what I do, I said, yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
for
come
sure.
on. Now, who would turn down like 3-4 days? And yeah, they put me up at, I forget the name of the hotel, right on Park Central, Central Park West. I think it was called Madison. Yeah, the Hotel Madison.
Okay.
Penthouse suite.
Not bad.
I got there. Oliver met me. We had dinner in the restaurant. I didn't know that Oliver was gay, but really doesn't matter. And then we went up to the room I had. We talked for a while, and then the reporters, the camera person that Oliver had, and a lighting person came in, put special light bulbs in for the camera effect. And we did the interview, which was about an hour, and that went well. And then, like me, I can't remember if Oliver interviewed me or if someone else interviewed me. I think it was Oliver. And then we were waiting for, the two people who were missing was De Niro and Robin Williams.
Okay.
There's a knock on the door. The door opens, and a very casual Robert De Niro walks in the room. Hi, everyone. And so everyone, kind of knew him except myself. So I, extended my hand. And he kind of briefly said hi, and went over, sat down. He too was a furious note taker, but not with 4 different colored pens. So he sat down, and most of the rest of the time he was there, he would sit and write for like half an hour, and then he would pop every once in a while. He'd just mid everyone else's conversation go, I have a question. Can you tell me if he'd ask a question, get an answer, and then write for another 20 minutes or whatever. And then we're waiting for Robin. Well, 20 minutes, half hour goes by, the phone rings. Oliver goes over, picks up the room phone. I hear him going, huh? Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll be ready. Yeah, I understood what needs to be done. He hangs up and says, everybody, be on guard. Robin's downstairs in the lobby. He's being literally attacked by a group of like young girls, like teenage girls. He said he's racing up the inside stairwell, and it was like, I think it was 10 floors. He's racing up the stairwell. When he gets here, he's going to tap. We got to open the door and get him in here real quickly because security is going to be coming up also without security. So I was in this tapping on this door. We open the door, and all of a sudden, Robin does to this day, I don't know if it was intentional or unintentional. Yeah. He falls, does a head like somersault, I guess, not a cartwheel, somersault, where you tuck your head in, he just rolls over onto the floor. We slammed the door, and we see these girls coming up the stairwell, security. We just lock the door. And it was incredible. I will tell you that I have never met anybody with more soul, I honestly feel that, I don't know if you've encountered the term soulmate.
Absolutely.
Some people use it in a romantic sense only. But to me, a soulmate is someone you connect with on a spiritual, emotional level deeply. That's what happened with Robin. I mean, when we were first sitting with everyone else at the couch in the living room, Robin and I would have these urges. Mine was somewhat Tourettic. His was from the humor perspective. We'd have these urges to get up and mimic and do something strange. And at one time, we got up at the same time and almost knocked each other unconscious. We clapped heads together where we both went backwards. At which point, Robin said, we need somewhere quiet to talk. We went into the bedroom, closed the door. For 2.5, it must have been over 2 hours, we sat and we talked. And I mean, he opened up about parts of his life I'm sure he didn't talk often about publicly, about cocaine, about sexual situations he's gotten himself into, about different parts of his life. Now, I remember at one point he was standing looking out at Central Park, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed. And we said it at the same time. He said, life isn't what was promised to us, was it? We almost said the exact words at the same moment.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
wow. I mean, it was a real bond. I wish he was more of he was a regular guy. I mean, regular in the sense of being local and accessible. But whenever he came to the Boston area or even New York, he'd make sure I'd, have, 5 or 6 tickets to bring friends to come see him.
Oh, that's cool.
And it was really funny because I remember the next time I saw him, he was doing a fundraiser for Senator Kerry here in Massachusetts. And myself and my friend Joanne, who has Tourette, attended the fundraiser. And Robin's up there. That's why we attended. Robin's up there. He's doing his routine. And, of course, when you're ticking so much, you don't always know how much you're ticking.
Right. Yeah.
So out there, and all of a sudden, mid-comedy routine, he stops, puts his hand like over his eyes because of the spot, to block the spots, looks out in the audience, he goes, "I'm not sure if we've got a couple of hecklers out there or if those are my buddies with Tourette from Boston." And, of course, I yelled out, I go, "It's okay, Robin, you're safe. Let's go."
That's cool.
"Okay, buddy." I said, "You can go back to the show now. Thanks, Steve."
Steve Bachner passed away December 15th, 2021. According to his obituary, you can make donations in his memory to the Blind Cat Rescue, that's blindcatrescue.com, OCD Massachusetts at ocdmassachusetts.com, and the Tourette Association of America, tourette.org. I hope you enjoyed listening to this, and I hope you'll keep Steve in your thoughts as we remember what he went through and how he benefited us as a community of human beings. Tourette's podcast is made possible by the Tourette Association of America, online at tourette.org. Look for some updates on the podcast soon. We are online at tourettespodcast.com and on the usual socials. All right, well, thanks for listening, everybody. This has been Steve Bachner. Rest in peace.